Hi, welcome. I'm Mike Bovington, pastor of the Lutheran Church of the Good Shepherd in Douglasville, Georgia. Today is the 8th Sunday after Pentecost, and our gospel lesson that we shared in our worship services this morning came from Matthew, and it's a series of parables that Jesus tells. Let me share that with you. Jesus put before them another parable. Kingdom of heaven's like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all seeds, but when it is grown, it's the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and they make nests in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid, and then when his joy goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. And again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and he bought it. And again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and caught fish of every kind. When it was full, they drew it ashore, sat down, and put the good in the baskets and threw out the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the furnace of fire. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all this? And they answered, yes. He said to them, therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household, who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. This is the gospel of the Lord. And whoever decided that we should have a Sunday where there are, 7 or 8 parables in one passage, and then pastors should try and find a way to preach about that. Well, that's kind of tough. But the part about it, one of them that really strikes me, is that when he goes through all these parables and he looks at the disciples and said, have you understood all this? And they said, yes. I don't think they did. Reminded of a story of a man who went into one of these computer dating services, and he said, I'm looking for a woman. I don't care what she looks like. I don't care where she comes from. I just want a woman with intelligence. Later that week, a woman comes in and says, I'm looking for a man. I don't care what he looks like. I don't care how much money he has or where he lives. I just want a man with integrity. So they put those two together, the reason being that they were both compulsive liars. When a disciple said, yes, I think they're lying. But I'm not going to point a finger at anybody else. I really have come to realize in my life that it's me. I'm the compulsive liar. Not to you, and not to my family, but to myself. There's a lot about me that doesn't want to admit who I really am. I don't want to see myself for who I am. I remember my parents telling me that anything worthwhile in this world is going to cost you something. Nothing's free. I think if I look at all these parables together, Jesus is talking about this faith. There's a cost. That pearl, that treasure is going to cost you everything you got. And he's saying the kingdom is worthy of that cost. When I think about the cost of the kingdom, one of the people that strikes me is John the Baptist. And well, let me tell you first. When my sister got engaged, they asked me if I would be willing to perform the ceremony. My sister wanted for me to do her wedding, and I was excited. I was glad to. It was such a great time until my father started going around and telling people there are big problems in our family. His son was marrying his daughter. Well, the life of John the Baptist was cost by some of those really kind of weird relationships. You know, Herod marries his brother's wife, Herodias, who is also his niece. And then Salome dances for him, and he has these thoughts he should not have about his grandniece and his stepdaughter. But Herodias convinces Salome after Herod says, I'll give you anything you want, to ask for the head of John the Baptist on a plate. He gets it. For John the Baptist, he wasn't given the option to opt out. For John the Baptist, everything he valued, everything that was important in his life, cost him his life. For me, I get to opt out. Things get tough, I opt out for that which is comfortable. When things get a little dicey, I can opt out for that which is safe. When things are challenging, I can step back into those old ways of looking at this world and living in this world. And I think, what is my faith costing me? How much am I willing to give up? How much have I been willing to give up for that treasure in the field and for that pearl? What does it cost me? This grace is an amazing thing, this unconditional, this outrageous love of God. But it can't be cheap. It's got to be worth something. Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about cheap grace, and he said grace is costly because it calls us to follow, but it's grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It's costly because it costs one their life, but it's grace because it gives us the only true life. Above all, it's costly because it cost God the life of his Son. And yet what has cost God so much cannot be cheap for us. Above all, it's grace because God did not reckon his dear Son too dear a price to pay for our life. What's it cost me? Am I willing to give up my comfort for the sake of righteousness? Am I willing to opt out of safety for the sake of justice? Can I be willing to give up part of myself and my old ways so I can see people in new ways and I can love more greatly than I loved before? Am I willing? Paul says that nothing can separate us from the love of God. Jesus tells us we're loved by grace. It's not about being saved. It's about being thankful. And it's about letting what matters in this world and what we value in this world change our lives. I can lie to myself, or I can realize that even when I fail, I can still follow. And that kingdom, that treasure, and that pearl is worth everything I got. It's an old story about a guest preacher in a church, and he's preaching, and he said, it's time this church got up and walked. And from the back he heard, "Let it walk, preacher, let it walk." A little while later he said, you know what? He was moved. He said, it's time this church got up and ran. And from the back he heard, "Let it run, preacher, let it run." He said, it's time this church got up and flew. And from the back he said, "Let it fly, preacher, let it fly." And he said, for this church to fly, it's time this church got up and gives. And from the back he heard, "Let it walk, preacher, let it walk." It's hard to give. That pearl's worth everything. It's worth our comfort. It's worth our safety. It's worth living with risk, to love a little bit deeper, a little bit wider, a little bit more. God loves you. Let us love one another. Thanks for listening.